So the moment that ignited the Second Punic War, which, just as an aside, that people always ask, like, why is it the Punic War? I didn't know why it was called this. Basically, the Romans would call the people of Carthage because they were originally settled by the Phoenicians. So it was the Phoenician traders that actually went up to Tunisia and kind of developed this place that then the empire grew from. And the Romans called them the Poni, or the Puni. And so over time, it just became the Punic. So basically, the Punic Wars were against the Phoenician lineage in Carthage against the Roman people. And as we know, the first one happened. Carthage had a bad defeat. So now it's time for round two. And this happens in 219 BC when Hannibal set his sights on Saguntum. This was a city on the eastern coast of Spain. Now, Saguntum was allied with Rome, but lay in a region Carthage considered basically within the sphere of influence. So when Roman ambassadors arrived to warn Hannibal attack Saguntum and face war with all of Rome, he wasn't intimidated. Driven by this sacred oath, he essentially replied, "Someone stop me. What y'all gonna do?" So the siege dragged on for 8 months, and Hannibal wasn't leading from the back. He wasn't, sitting back in Carthage looking through binoculars or whatever. He was on the front lines, shoulder to shoulder with his men. Ancient sources highlight his remarkable ability to endure the hardships as even his lowest soldiers. And from that, he really would earn their loyalty on the battlefield. They would have followed him to the ends of the earth, right? So when the city finally fell, his strategic mind showed through. He kept the money for his war chest, basically to fund the battles that he wanted to do, and distributed the slaves among his soldiers and sent the remaining plunder to Carthage. When news reached Rome, the Senate was pissed. The Romans are livid. They sent ambassadors to Carthage with basically an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal or face war. The Carthaginian Senate was divided. The merchant class, still recovering from the last war's devastation, didn't want another costly conflict with anyone, specifically Rome. They saw Hannibal as like this dangerous, crazy wild man whose ambitions would basically threaten like their careful rebuilding efforts. They were like, we don't need war. We can just trade. We still have a nice little spot. We don't want to get destroyed by the Romans. The Old Guard, led by Hanno the Great, argued passionately for appeasement, but the memory of this first Punic War and the humiliation that came with it was deep, and there were still those who shared the Barca family's hunger for revenge. So when the Roman ambassador dramatically shook the folds of his toga and declared, "Here I carry peace and war. Choose which you will have," enough senators remember their lost pride, and they chose war. So Hannibal was already putting his audacious plan into motion. By the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal embarked on what would become one of history's most legendary expeditions ever. His army was massive, 90,000 men, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. Yeah, we're talking legit war elephants. But he wasn't heading to Rome by the expected route. He was going to do something that the Romans thought was impossible, and that is to cross the Alps. Now, if you take a look at the map, you can see where Carthage is and you can see where the Alps are. So you can imagine the Roman shock when they realized what was happening. They had expected to intercept Hannibal in southern France, but he was already crossing the Rhone River and was heading straight for the mountains. Now, the Rhone crossing itself was a masterpiece of military engineering. Getting 100,000 men across a major river is hard enough, but doing it with elephants, unheard of. Hannibal built these special rafts that extended into the river like piers, basically. And then the female elephants were led onto these first, with the males following behind them. And when the rafts were cut loose and basically towed across, some of the elephants would panic and they fell into the water. But amazingly, they survived because they would just kind of pop their trunks out and just kind of breathe a little bit. But the real test was still ahead: the Alps. You can imagine the Alps, right? This is at this point, an uncrossable mountain range. It's massive, hostile terrain defended by local tribes, and then winter is on its way. If you guys get stuck in the Alps in the middle of winter, you're cooked. No army of any comparable size had ever even attempted a crossing like this. So as Hannibal's army began its ascent in late autumn, they faced not just the brutal geography, but constant attacks from local tribes all across the region who basically would launch ambushes on them from the heights, rolling boulders down onto, the troops below. The higher they climbed, the worse the conditions became. They had early snow that year, which made the paths treacherous. At one point, a landslide destroyed the entire part of their pathway completely. So the troops are starting to get a little pissed. They're like, "Hey, Hannibal, I think maybe we missed a turn or something. I think we're a little lost." And they were ready to give up when they were now staring at what seemed like, certain death. But Hannibal rallied them. with vision, ultimately. He climbed to the highest point and showed them the fertile Italian plains spread out below, their destination, and ultimately their reward if they could just hold on and endure the impossible. Now, if you know anything about climbing the mountain's only half the battle, because then you got to go down. And for Hannibal, the going down part was even worse than going up. Fresh snow over, old ice basically created these conditions where the men and the animals were now just slipping, and a couple men just were slipping to their death, and animals, elephants. It was a shit show. At one particularly dangerous passage, Hannibal ordered his soldiers to build a path along a cliff face, which was basically like this engineering marvel that no one would even thought was possible. And it took him 3 days. But after 15 days of just pure hell, Hannibal finally reached the plains of northern Italy. The cost had been enormous. Of his original 100,000 plus army, only 26,000 remained. I mean, think about that. A quarter of them actually made it over the Alps. All but one of his precious elephants were dead or dying. But he did it. He had brought an army across the Alps, and his arrival in Italy sent shockwaves through the Roman world, and the nightmare had only just begun. What happened next was like watching a masterclass in military brilliance. Over the next 2 years, Hannibal would deliver 3 crushing defeats that established him as one of history's greatest tactical minds ever. The Battle of Trebia came first, and this was in December of 218 BC. The Roman commander Tiberius Sempronius was the exact kind of opponent Hannibal loved to face. He was proud and he was impatient, but he was predictable. And when Hannibal sent his cavalry to harass the Roman camp on this freezing winter morning, Sempronius took the bait. The Romans pursued without even stopping for breakfast. They just went after him, and they had to cross this icy Trebia River and arrived to the battlefield with, cold, wet, and hungry troops. Meanwhile, Hannibal had fed his troops well and prepared them for this battle, and more importantly, he had hidden his brother Mago with 2,000 hand-picked men across the river. You could think like a special operations team. So as the battle raged, just when the Romans thought that they were pushing forward successfully and getting these guys that were basically harassing their camp, Mago's hidden forces struck from behind. Caught between Hannibal's main army and the ambush, the Roman army disintegrated. According to Polybius, around 15,000 Romans were killed in this one battle, while Livy suggests that it could have been around 30,000 were killed or captured, with only 10,000 managing to escape. 6 months later came Lake Trasimene, perhaps the most perfect ambush ever to be done in military history ever. Hannibal deliberately ravaged the countryside to provoke the new Roman consul Gaius Flaminius into basically the same exact thing. He wanted them to, go into like a quick sort of unprompted pursuit. So as the Roman army followed along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, they entered a narrow passage between the lake and the surrounding hills. A morning mist kind of concealed the fact that Hannibal had positioned troops on every height around them. When the Romans were fully committed to this chase and ultimately kind of a ruse, Hannibal gave the signal. Bang! Attacks come from all sides simultaneously. The Romans couldn't form proper battle lines. They couldn't even understand what was happening. In the slaughter that followed, 15,000 Roman soldiers died, including Flaminius himself. But Hannibal wasn't done yet. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BC stands as one of the most brilliant military victories in all of history. Rome, finally understanding the magnitude of the threat that is Hannibal, assembled the largest army in its history, somewhere between 80,000, 90,000 men, including both legionaries and allies, support staff, everything they could throw at Hannibal, basically to crush this Carthaginian invader once and for all. The psychological impact on Roman society was immense. Refugees streamed into Rome with basically just like these horror stories of Hannibal and, these supernatural abilities that he possessed, and panic started to go through all of Rome. I mean, they were buying stuff in the markets, and wealthy families were moving their valuables out of the city, and the poor were wondering if the gods had basically just abandoned Rome entirely. I mean, Hannibal took on more than just a military personality. They thought he was like an actual like demon or something. They were like, this guy is supernatural or contains some type of, mystic capabilities. So Hannibal, in this exact moment, is outnumbered, but he arranges his forces in a crescent formation that would become legendary to this day. He basically placed his weakest troops in the center, with his veteran North African troops basically on the flanks, and whose superior cavalry held onto the wings. So as the battle began, the Romans did exactly what Hannibal expected. They pushed forward against his center, which gradually gave ground while, maintained cohesion of the rest of the crescent. And this was a deliberate tactic to basically lure them in. And this controlled withdrawal basically drew the Romans deeper and deeper into what was becoming a death trap. Hannibal's cavalry routed the Roman horsemen and then swept around to attack the Roman infantry from behind. So if you can imagine like this moon shape, basically the Romans went straight in and then they closed in a circle around them. And the Romans found themselves just completely surrounded, pressed from the front by troops that basically had stopped retreating and squeezed from both sides by the infantry and then attacked from behind from the returning cavalry. And what followed was less a battle rather than it was just a execution, basically. Packed so tightly that they could barely move. They were just getting crushed and crushed and crushed. 50 to 70,000 Roman and allied soldiers were killed or captured in a single day. But the vast majority of them had perished. For the population sizes of the time, this was a catastrophic loss. You got to think, at just this battle alone, somewhere between 50 to 70,000. Many of them former consuls, current consuls, numerous senators, all killed. Cannae was the perfect execution of what military historians call the double envelopment. And this was a maneuver that was so difficult to do that very few commanders in history have ever successfully replicated it. So after Cannae, the Romans were basically, crushed and reeling from maybe its greatest military disaster ever. And Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, urged immediate action. He basically said, you know how to win battles, but not how to use your victories. So after this moment, why didn't Hannibal march onto Rome itself? And the answer here reveals both Hannibal's strategic vision, but also some of the limitations that he faced. So despite his victories, Hannibal's armies had suffered casualties and was far from its supply bases. And if you know anything about, military tactics, supply lines are arguably more important than anything. He lacked the, heavy siege equipment needed to actually get through Rome's massive walls. And more importantly, his political constraints from Carthage were actually becoming more apparent. So the Carthaginian Senate, dominated by merchants who feared the economic backlash of this type of prolonged war, had been reluctant to send the adequate reinforcements. While Hannibal was winning these impossible victories in Italy, the politicians back home were looking at the margins and the numbers, and they worried about retaliation from Rome. It also kind of tells us that Hannibal's goal wasn't necessarily the physical destruction of Rome itself. His strategy was to dismantle Rome's confederation of Italian allies. And initially, this strategy showed some promise. After Cannae, several important cities in southern Italy, including Capua, switched sides. But Hannibal had made a fundamental miscalculation. He underestimated the resilience of the Roman alliance system.